On that fateful autumn morning, 6-year-old Ethan trembled as he pulled the metal cage from the river. Inside lay a silver-gray German shepherd, lifeless and soaked in blood. But as Ethan touched it, its eyes slowly opened, staring straight into him, and a voice echoed in his mind. "My name is Shadow. Thank you." Subscribe now to watch our upcoming emotional and powerful film episodes. The sun had barely risen above the Rockies when Ethan's small bare feet touched the cold wooden floorboards of his room. The window was cracked open from the night before, letting in a breath of crisp autumn air that smelled like pine needles and river mist. He blinked sleep from his lashes, pulling the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders. The dim room glowed with dawn light, slanting golden lines across his drawings, taped to the walls, crayon sketches of dogs running under a sun with too many rays. He slipped out of bed, quietly careful not to make the old frame creak. Grandpa James was already awake. Ethan could hear the rhythmic tapping of a hammer on wood outside each strike, echoing through the silent house like a ticking clock. Ethan liked mornings like this, when the world hadn't yet decided what it would be. When it felt like he and the sun were the only two awake to witness secrets meant only for them. Pulling on his gray sweatshirt with the faded red letters spelling Denver Elementary, Ethan padded into the small kitchen. The fridge hummed softly. A note from Grandpa James was stuck to the freezer, with a magnet shaped like a trout. "Morning chores first. Breakfast on the stove. Love, G." Ethan read it twice, as he always did. He wasn't yet fully confident with reading, but Grandpa's blocky handwriting was easy to decipher. On the counter, a pot of oatmeal still steamed under a metal lid. Ethan scooped a small portion into his chipped white bowl, poured a river of honey over it, and sat by the window as he ate. Outside, the mountains loomed purple in the distance, their peaks lined with the first frost of the season. The cottonwood trees were turning gold along the creek, and a pair of magpies hopped across the fence posts, their feathers glinting black-blue under the new sun. After breakfast, Ethan slipped on his sneakers blue with orange laces he'd tied himself and grabbed the burlap sack from the hook by the door. Grandpa James always said, "Don't come back with less than half full." Ethan didn't mind. Picking up bottles and cans along the roadside gave him time to think, to wonder. The screen door creaked when he pushed it open. The porch smelled like sawdust and cedar shavings. Grandpa James was there, hunched over a rough pine plank, balanced between two sawhorses. His thick gray hair stuck out from under an old Rockies baseball cap. His denim shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing corded arms lined with sun-browned freckles. Each tap of the hammer drove another brass nail into the chair leg he was repairing. "Morning, Peanut," Grandpa James said without looking up. "Morning, Grandpa," Ethan whispered back. His voice was soft, but Grandpa always heard him. "Don't forget the South Trail today. Folks drop cans by the fishing rocks." Ethan nodded and started down the steps. The wooden planks creaked under his light weight, and the old wind chime hanging from the porch beam rattled in a soft breeze. The chime was made of steel pipes welded together, a project Grandpa had made years ago. It sounded low and mournful, like a whale calling across an ocean. The yard was small, framed by barbed wire fencing, sagging in places where elk had leaned against it to scratch their winter coats away. Beyond the fence, the land sloped down to the river that cut through the valley, its waters sparkling under the climbing sun. Ethan walked with his eyes lowered, scanning the grass and gravel for glints of aluminum or clear glass. The burlap sack bumped against his thin legs as he walked half empty from the day before. A raven croaked from the cottonwood above, its shadow flickering over the boy as it took flight. Halfway down the South Trail, Ethan paused to watch two joggers running past. They wore bright neon vests and had earbuds tucked under their knit hats. One of them was holding a retractable leash. At the end of it bounded a golden retriever, its ears flopping as it ran, tongue hanging out with joy. Ethan stopped walking and watched as the dog trotted proudly beside its owner, its bushy tail waving like a flag. His chest ached with a small, quiet pain that felt almost sweet. He imagined what it would be like to run like that, wind in his hair, a dog at his side laughing without caring if anyone heard. The joggers disappeared around a bend, and Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He shifted the sack onto his other shoulder and kept walking. Near the fishing rocks, he found 3 crushed Coors cans and a glass bottle with its label peeling off. He crouched to pick them up, brushing away sand from the bottle's surface before dropping it into his bag. Each clink and clatter echoed in the morning quiet. The river flowed steadily beside him, gray and silver under the sunrise. Mist hovered above its surface, curling around driftwood and half-submerged boulders. Ethan paused to skip a small stone across the water. It bounced twice before sinking with a faint plunk. He smiled at the ripples spreading outward, overlapping in complex patterns. 7 skips, he whispered to himself. He liked counting the skips, even if no one else saw. When the sack felt half full, Ethan turned back toward home. The path climbed gently through clusters of sagebrush and juniper. His sneakers crunched over gravel and fallen cottonwood leaves, the smell of autumn sharp and earthy around him. As the house came into view, Ethan saw Grandpa James still working on the porch. The old man had set aside the chair leg and was now sanding a wide cedar plank, the motion of his hands steady and deliberate. Beside him sat a blue enamel mug, steam curling from its rim. Ethan walked up the steps, placed his sack by the door, and sat cross-legged at the edge of the porch, watching Grandpa work. The rhythmic rasp of sandpaper over wood soothed him, like listening to the river at night. "Good haul," Grandpa asked, glancing over. Ethan nodded. "Attaboy. We'll take it into town Saturday." Grandpa set down the sandpaper and stretched his back joints, cracking softly. He picked up his coffee mug and took a long sip. Steam fogged his wire-rimmed glasses for an instant. Ethan watched his grandfather's hands. Large, square-knuckled, darkened with years of engine oil, wood stain, and soil. Hands that smelled like cedar and tobacco. Hands that felt safe. "See any critters today?" Grandpa asked, scratching his whiskered cheek. "A golden retriever," Ethan said softly. "Yeah, pretty one." Ethan nodded, very happy. Grandpa smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Dogs are good souls. They see us clearer than we see ourselves." Ethan didn't answer. He just looked down at his own hands, small, thin, with bitten nails and 2 faint scars across his left knuckle from falling off his bike last summer. His chest felt tight again, the quiet ache blooming there. "Someday, Peanut," Grandpa said, as if reading his mind, "someday we'll get you a dog." Ethan blinked up at him, eyes wide. "Really? When we can afford the food and the vet bills? Dogs deserve to be cared for proper." Ethan nodded, though his heart felt like it was flying away into the golden sky. A dog. A friend. Someone who would always listen, even if he didn't speak. Grandpa ruffled his hair gently. "Get washed up. You got schoolwork before lunch." Ethan stood and went inside, his mind filled with the image of that golden retriever trotting under the morning sun. He imagined himself running beside it barefoot on soft grass, laughing so loud the whole valley would hear. In his room, he folded the burlap sack, carefully laying it at the foot of his narrow bed. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, pulling his workbook from under the mattress. The cover was worn corners, curled from months of use. He flipped it open to a blank page and drew a dog with pointed ears and bright eyes. Not a golden retriever, he realized as he traced the outline of its strong legs and bushy tail. No, this one was different. This one was wild and free, but gentle too. Loyal. Underneath the drawing in letters, shaped carefully and slowly, Ethan wrote one word: friend. Outside his window, the sun rose higher over the mountains, turning the cottonwoods brilliant gold. The wind chime on the porch sang its low morning note. Grandpa James kept sanding the cedar plank, his hands moving in steady rhythm, building something solid to outlast the winter. Ethan pressed his palm to the drawing, as if trying to touch the creature he had sketched to life. He closed his eyes and imagined its breath against his face, warm and smelling of forest and snow. He imagined curling up beside it on cold nights, his fingers buried in its thick fur, the rise and fall of its chest, a lullaby to his small, lonely heart. In that quiet autumn morning, with the sun painting the world gold, Ethan did not yet know that the dog he was imagining was already on its way to him. That even now, miles upriver, a silver-gray husky with broken paws and a breaking heart was limping along the water's edge, leaving a trail of blood and hope in equal measure. He did not know that by dusk, their worlds would collide in a way that would shatter everything he thought he knew about life, about friendship, and about the darkness that people could inflict on creatures who only wanted to love. He did not know. But perhaps deep inside, where dreams begin and words cannot reach, Ethan felt a flicker of it, a whisper at the edge of his thoughts. "Hold on, I'm coming." And in that moment, for reasons he could not explain, Ethan smiled. Ethan walked the southern trail with the burlap sack slung across his small shoulders, the morning sun slowly rising higher behind him. His shoes crunched over the fallen cottonwood leaves, each step sending a crisp crackle into the silent air. Down here by the river, it always felt cooler. The banks were lined with willows bending their slender arms toward the water, their yellowing leaves brushing the swirling surface like fingertips reaching for something they could never hold. He paused by a patch of grass littered with beer cans, their silver skins glinting sharply in the sun. Carefully, he picked each one up, flattened them under his sneaker with a practiced stomp, and dropped them into his sack. The echo of aluminum collapsing filled the empty space around him, reminding him of breaking bones in the movies Grandpa sometimes watched after Ethan was asleep. But Ethan never flinched. There was something satisfying about the finality of it broken done quiet. Beyond the fishing rocks, the river widened and slowed, spreading into a lazy bend where sandbars formed small islands. Ethan always checked there for glass bottles. Grown-ups liked to drink there at night, leaving their shards half buried in the damp mud. Grandpa James told him once, people throw away what they don't want to face in daylight. Ethan didn't fully understand, but he remembered it anyway. He skipped down the sandy slope, nearly losing his balance as his sneakers slid through the fine gravel. The burlap sack bumped against his back with each jump. At the bottom, he stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle into his bones. The river burbled softly over the rocks, carrying fragments of sky and cloud in its mirrored surface. A blue heron lifted from the far bank wings, beating the air with slow, heavy strokes. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a flash of metal under the water, reflecting the sun in a jagged burst. Ethan squinted, shading his eyes with one small hand. He took a hesitant step forward. The river here was shallow, but fast curling around a large boulder, mossed with dark green algae. Near the rock, wedged between two smaller stones, was a rusted iron cage. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was half submerged, the upper bars barely poking above the surface. Inside, something moved slowly, weakly, a trembling shape pressed against the iron bars. He dropped his sack without thinking, the cans clattering onto the pebbles behind him. His feet splashed into the icy shallows as he waded forward each step, sending frigid pain up his thin legs. The water reached his knees, soaking his jeans, numbing his skin. He shivered violently but kept moving until he stood directly over the cage. What he saw made his heart twist so hard it hurt to breathe. Inside the cage was a dog, a large husky with a thick, tangled coat of silver and gray. Its head was pressed against the bars, muzzle tilted just above water. Its eyes, when they flickered open, were a cloudy pale blue, the color of frozen lakes in winter. They stared up at him, without focus, half-lidded with exhaustion. "Hey," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with shock and fear. "Hey, buddy. Hey." The husky didn't move beyond a faint twitch of its ear. Bubbles rose from its nose as it breathed slow and ragged. Its entire body shivered uncontrollably, the water wicking heat away with every second. Ethan felt panic rise inside him, clawing up his chest, tightening his throat. He looked around wildly. There was no one else here. No fishermen, no joggers, no Grandpa James to come running down the trail. Just him. Just him and this dying animal. His pulse roared in his ears. He could feel it hammering at his temples. The river's chill seeped into his bones, but another heat burned through his chest, a fierce, desperate determination that overrode everything else. "I'm gonna get you out," he whispered. "Hold on." He hooked his numb fingers under the cage's top bar and pulled. It didn't budge. The rocks wedged against its sides held it firmly in place. He gritted his teeth, tears springing to his eyes from cold and frustration. He tried again, bracing his foot against a submerged stone and heaving with every ounce of strength in his small body. The cage shifted half an inch, the metal scraping against rock with a grating squeal. The husky whimpered softly, a sound so weak it barely rose above the rush of water. Ethan's tears spilled over, now hot streaks that froze on his cheeks. "Please," he gasped out loud, not sure if he was speaking to the dog or to something bigger. "Please don't die. Please." He sucked in a breath so deep it felt like it split his ribs apart. Then he threw his weight backward, lifting with his legs, pulling with his arms, screaming out with the effort. The cage jerked free, sending a spray of river water across his face. It was heavier than anything he had ever tried to lift before, the iron bars slick with algae and rust. With trembling steps, he dragged it backward toward the shore. His sneakers slipped on underwater pebbles. Twice he fell to his knees, soaking himself to the waist, but he scrambled back up without pause. Inch by inch, foot by foot, he pulled the cage into shallower water until finally it scraped onto wet sand. Ethan collapsed beside it, gasping his chest, burning lungs sucking in air that felt like fire. His fingers were raw skin torn in thin red lines where rust and grit had bitten into them. He pushed his dripping hair out of his eyes and turned to look at the husky. The dog lay limp inside the cage, sides heaving. Up close, Ethan could see how thin it was. Ribs pressed against stretched skin, patches of fur missing in angry red welts. The pads of its paws were cracked and bleeding, dark scabs caked with river mud. Its breath rattled wetly in its throat, each exhale a labored struggle. "Don't die," Ethan whispered again. He reached out, wrapping his fingers around the rusty latch. It was sealed with an old padlock crusted brown with age and river sediment. He frantically searched the sand around him for a rock. His eyes landed on a fist-sized piece of granite. He grabbed it, raised it high, and slammed it down onto the padlock with a shout. The impact jarred his wrist to the bone, sending a flare of pain up his arm. The padlock didn't break. He hit it again and again. Tears blurred his vision, his throat tight with sobs. Water dripped from his soaked sleeves onto the lock, mixing with the rust and dark orange rivulets. Please, please. On the fifth strike, the brittle, corroded metal cracked. Ethan shoved the rock aside and pulled the broken padlock free, tossing it into the sand. His fingers fumbled with the latch before wrenching it open. The cage door swung outward with a screech of twisted hinges. For a moment, nothing happened. The husky didn't move. Its chest still rose and fell, shallow and quick. Its eyes were closed now. Ethan reached inside, resting his trembling hand on the dog's wet, matted head. "Hey, wake up," he whispered. "It's okay. You're out. You're okay now." The husky stirred under his touch. Slowly, its eyes flickered open again, rolling weakly to focus on his face. Pale blue met dark brown, and for a single searing moment, Ethan felt like the world stopped turning. Everything, the river's rush, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant crow calls, fell silent. In that silence, he heard a voice. Not with his ears, not with his mind, even. But somewhere deeper, in a place where words didn't exist, but meaning still lived. "My name is Shadow. Thank you, little one." Ethan gasped, pulling his hand back as if burned. His heart thundered so loud it hurt. The voice had been inside him, warm, quiet, low like thunder far away. He blinked at the husky, mouth open, unable to speak. The dog's eyes closed again, but not in surrender. Its breathing calmed, deepened as if his touch and his presence were enough to keep it anchored to the world. "I won't let you die," Ethan whispered fiercely, leaning forward until his forehead pressed against Shadow's cold, wet nose. "You're mine now. You're my friend, and I won't let you die." The wind picked up, rustling the willows with a dry sigh. The sun had risen higher above the mountains, burning away the river mist in glowing sheets of gold. Ethan sat there, with his knees in the sand arms, around the half-dead, husky tears and river water dripping down his small face. His chest ached with a feeling so big he couldn't name it hope and fear, and something stronger than either. Shadow did not speak again. But in the hush of that golden morning, Ethan felt something blooming inside his heart. A quiet vow, a fragile promise, growing roots deep inside his soul. "I will save you, even if no one else will." And the world, for the first time in a long time, felt like it was listening. Ethan's hands wouldn't stop shaking. His fingers, red and scraped from wrenching open the rusted cage, hovered over Shadow's soaked fur. He wanted to pet the dog to reassure it somehow, but his mind was a tangled mess of terror and awe. The voice he'd heard still echoed inside him, not like a memory of sound, but like a vibration etched deep into his bones. Shadow shivered violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Each inhale sounded like water gurgling in a clogged drain. Ethan watched as the husky's eyes rolled back for a moment, revealing slivers of white. Panic surged through him, slamming into his chest with a force that stole his breath. "No, no, no, don't go," he whispered. He pressed both palms against Shadow's neck, feeling for a pulse. It fluttered there, thin and rapid under wet skin. The dog's fur was freezing, tangled with river mud and debris. Ethan looked around desperately. He couldn't leave him here. If he did, Shadow would die alone. "Come on," he said, voice trembling. "Come on. We're going home." He grabbed the husky under its front legs, hooking his arms around its chest. The dog was heavier than it looked. Its limp body dragged through the sand, leaving a trail of water and blood and broken reeds. Ethan's small feet slipped as he pulled Shadow away from the riverbank, the burlap sack of cans forgotten where it lay, crumpled in the mud. Each step felt like wading through wet cement. His soaked jeans clung to his legs, chafing his knees raw. The cold bit into his skin until it burned, then numbed, then burned again. He gritted his teeth, eyes locked on the narrow dirt trail ahead. Halfway up the slope, Shadow let out a low groan. His hind legs kicked weakly claws, scraping at the dirt, but he couldn't stand. Ethan paused, panting hard. His arms trembled from effort, his shoulders screamed with pain, but he didn't let go. "It's okay," he whispered through chattering teeth. Almost there. The wind picked up, tugging at Ethan's wet hair, turning his skin to ice. Shadow whimpered again, a broken, desperate sound that made something split open in Ethan's chest. Tears spilled down his cheeks, hot against the cold wind. He kept moving. The yard appeared beyond the cottonwoods, framed by the sagging barbed wire fence. Grandpa James was nowhere in sight. Good. Ethan didn't want to explain. Not yet. He dragged Shadow across the yard, the husky's body leaving dark smears on the dried dirt. The porch loomed ahead, but Ethan bypassed it, heading for the small shed at the back of the house, the old woodpile shelter. Its roof patched with corrugated tin walls, half rotted with age. Inside it smelled of cedar mold and mice. Long-forgotten garden tools leaned in corners, cobwebbed and rusted. Broken crates were stacked against the far wall. Ethan pulled one down and laid it on its side, creating a small sheltered space near the back. "Okay," he whispered, lowering Shadow onto an old burlap feed sack spread over the dirt floor. The dog's body thumped onto it, limp and unmoving. Ethan pressed his hands to Shadow's ribs again, relief washing over him when he felt the frantic flutter of his pulse, still there, still fighting. "You're okay. You're safe now. You hear me safe." Shadow's eyes flickered open for a moment, cloudy blue and unfocused. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his eyes rolled closed again, and he fell still, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Ethan sat back on his heels, chest heaving with exhausted sobs. His hair dripped onto his knees. Mud streaked his sweatshirt. He felt cold all the way to his bones, but he didn't care. He just stared at Shadow's battered body, willing him to keep breathing. Minutes passed. The wind rattled the tin roof above them, sending small flecks of rust fluttering down. Somewhere outside, a crow cawed harshly. Ethan hugged his knees to his chest, pressing his forehead against them. He felt small and useless and terrified. But he didn't leave. He stayed listening to the dog's wet, rattling breaths echo in the dark. He didn't know how long he sat there before he heard the sound, a low groan, raspy and pained. His head snapped up. Shadow was stirring his paws, twitching against the burlap sack. Slowly, painfully, his eyes blinked open. For a moment, they were unfocused, staring past Ethan into the dim rafters above. Then, with a small shiver, his gaze locked onto Ethan's face. The boy held his breath. The world narrowed to those eyes, pale blue and clouded with exhaustion, but deeper than any lake, any sky, any ocean Ethan had ever seen. Shadow's muzzle moved. No sound came out, but Ethan felt it, a vibration in his chest, in his head, in that silent place inside him where thoughts formed before words could shape them. "Where am I?" Ethan swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, raw from crying and cold. "Home," he whispered. "You're home. You're safe now." Shadow's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they were wet with tears that mingled with river water on his fur. "Why? Why did you help me?" Because you were drowning." Ethan's voice cracked. "Because I don't want anyone to feel alone." Shadow let out a long, shuddering breath. His chest heaved once, twice, then settled into a shallow, steady rhythm. His eyes slid closed, but Ethan felt it again, the voice not in words, but in feeling. Gratitude. Relief. A quiet, broken kind of hope. He sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the husky breathe. When the cold grew too sharp, he stood and rummaged through the old crates. He found an oil-stained tarp and an old horse blanket thick with dust. He shook it out, coughing at the moldy scent, then laid it gently over Shadow's shivering body. The husky whimpered softly at the touch of warmth. His eyes flickered open once more, and Ethan saw a flicker of pain there, deeper than the cold, deeper than the wounds. "What happened to you?" The question wasn't spoken out loud. Ethan wasn't sure if he'd asked it or thought it. But the answer came anyway, flooding into his mind like water pouring into a cracked basement. Flashes, images, feelings that weren't his. He saw men in dark clothes, faces shadowed under wide hats. Their hands were rough and smelled of blood and gasoline. He felt ropes biting into his neck chains, clanking against concrete. He smelled the rank sweat of other dogs crammed together in cages too small to turn around in. He felt needles stabbing into muscle, burning liquid searing up his veins, turning his blood into fire. His heart pounding so hard he thought it would explode. His teeth gnashing against metal bars, a snarl ripping from his throat as he was shoved into an arena under hot desert sun. He heard cheering, shouting, the clink of money exchanging hands. He felt pain everywhere, inside and out, wounds ripped open by fangs and claws, by batons and electric prods. He felt exhaustion so deep it swallowed everything else. He felt fear, desperation, hatred, grief, then escape. Running through moonlit desert paws burning on sand and stone, bullets whining past his ears, blood dripping from his flank, the thunder of engines chasing him down long, lonely roads. Rivers, mountains, cold, hunger, exhaustion. Until Ethan. The vision faded, leaving Ethan gasping, tears streaming down his face. His small hands trembled where they rested on Shadow's neck. The Husky's eyes were open again, watching him with a weary, haunted gaze. They made me fight, the voice whispered inside Ethan's mind. They made us fight? Until we died. Ethan sobbed out loud, a ragged, broken sound. He pressed his forehead to Shadow's chest, feeling the weak thump of the dog's heart against his skin. Not anymore, he choked out. You're done fighting, I promise. You're safe. You're safe. Shadow's ragged breath shuddered through him. Ethan felt a flicker of something in that quiet mental space between them, a memory not of violence, but of warmth. Of a small child's hand reaching out in kindness. Of gentle voices. Of belly rubs under blue skies. Of love. I remember before, Ethan sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Before what? Before them. I was just a puppy. I had a boy. He loved me. Shadow's eyes drifted closed, a tear sliding from the corner of his eye into the matted fur of his cheek. They took me. Took us all. I tried to be good, but they made me a monster. No, Ethan said fiercely. He cupped Shadow's face between his small scraped palms, forcing the dog's eyes to meet his. You're not a monster. You're not. You're my friend. For a moment, neither of them moved. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the shed walls fell across them like slanted gold bars. Dust motes drifted in the quiet air. Outside, the wind sighed through the cottonwoods, and somewhere far away, a train whistle blew lonely and long. Shadow's eyes flickered at the pale blue, darkening with emotion Ethan couldn't name. The voice in his mind was faint, trembling, but filled with something he recognized instantly. Friend. Then Shadow's eyes closed, and he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. His breathing ragged but steady under the old horse blanket. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He sat there, his knees drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped tight around them. The ache in his shoulders from dragging Shadow, the cold burning his skin, the raw sting of his scrapes, all of it faded into the background. He stared at Shadow's battered body, at the rise and fall of his ribs, at the faint twitches in his paws, as he dreamed. Friend, Ethan whispered again, tasting the word like something holy. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what Grandpa James would say when he found out. He didn't know how he would feed him, or care for his wounds, or keep him safe from the people who had done this to him. But in that silent shed, with the wind rattling the tin roof and the smell of cedar and mold filling his lungs, Ethan made a promise to himself and to the broken creatures sleeping at his feet. I will never let them hurt you again. And somewhere deep inside him, he felt the answer quiet and sure, like the first glow of dawn before the sun rises. I know. The shed was cold, the smell of old cedar and rusted tools mixing with the faint, sharp tang of blood. Ethan knelt on the dirt floor beside Shadow, clutching the frayed edge of an ancient towel he'd found hanging from a bent nail near the door. His hands trembled as he dipped one end into a plastic bucket filled with lukewarm water. The water had gone cloudy brown within minutes, dark streaks swirling around the rim like smoke trapped in glass. He wrung out the towel and laid it gently against Shadow's side. The Husky flinched under his touch, a soft whimper leaking from between cracked lips. His fur was thick and matted, clumped with dried river mud and blood tangles pulling against raw, inflamed skin. Each time Ethan tried to work a knot loose, Shadow's entire body twitched with silent pain. I'm sorry, Ethan whispered, voice shaking. I'm so sorry. He worked slowly, methodically, dipping and wringing, wiping away the worst of the grime from Shadow's legs and belly. As the water cooled, Shadow's shivers grew more violent. Ethan paused, pressing his small palm flat against the Husky's ribcage. He could feel every rapid, shallow breath rattling through Shadow's chest. Underneath the fur, his bones were stark, jutting out like rocks under thin snow. His skin was scarred in thick, ridged lines, crisscrossing his shoulders and ribs, dark patches where fur had never grown back. Burns, knife cuts, bite wounds, bullet grazes. Ethan's tears fell soundlessly, landing hot against the cold of Shadow's fur. He tried to blink them away, but the harder he scrubbed the filth from the Husky's body, the thicker his tears flowed. He could feel something breaking open in his chest, an ache so deep it felt like his ribs were being pried apart. Shadow's pale blue eyes flickered open, cloudy and rimmed red. They turned slowly to focus on the boy's face. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sounds were the drip of water from the towel into the bucket and the ragged rasp of Shadow's labored breathing. Then Ethan felt it again, that quiet echo inside his mind. A vibration not in words at first, but in feeling, curiosity, confusion, sadness. And then the question formed in a voice so low and broken, It seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself. "You're not afraid of me?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His tears blurred the husky's face until he was just a trembling shape of silver and gray. "Afraid?" he whispered, wiping his nose on the back of his wrist. "Of you." Shadow blinked slowly, eyelids heavy with exhaustion. His lips twitched in what might once have been a snarl, but now was just a pained tremor. "They all were. They made me something to fear." Ethan swallowed hard. His eyes traveled down the husky's side, tracing each scar with his gaze. Long gouges crisscrossed his ribs. Circular burn scars, angry and pink, peppered his chest. Over his left shoulder blade, a wound had split the fur apart completely, leaving puckered, hairless skin that glimmered under the thin light like melted wax. He pressed the towel against that spot, wiping away a smear of dried blood. Shadow flinched again, teeth clacking softly as a choked whine rose in his throat. Ethan dropped the towel. He couldn't bear it anymore. He reached out with both hands, cradled Shadow's massive head between his trembling palms, and leaned down until his forehead rested against the husky's muzzle. Tears dripped from his chin onto Shadow's nose. "I'm not scared of you," he whispered, voice thick and cracking with sobs. I'm scared for you, because you're hurt, and no one deserves to be hurt like this." Shadow shivered again, but this time the trembling seemed different, less from cold, more from something deeper. His eyes fluttered shut, a single tear leaking from the corner to mingle with Ethan's on the dirt floor. The echo inside Ethan's mind quivered with quiet disbelief. "Hurt is what I am. Hurt is what I do. What I was made for." Ethan shook his head fiercely, forehead still pressed to Shadow's. "No," he whispered. "No, you're not made for this. You're not. You're my friend. The word slipped out before he could think to stop it. Friend. It felt too small for what burned inside his chest, but it was the only word he had. The only word he needed. Shadow let out a long, rattling sigh. His breath warmed Ethan's damp hair, smelled of blood and river mud, and something older. Something like dark pine forests under falling snow. For a moment, Ethan thought he felt it, the flicker of something bright buried deep inside the husky's battered heart. A warmth. A memory. "Friend." Shadow echoed in his mind, the voice trembling like a fallen leaf caught in winter wind. "I don't remember." "How?" Ethan pressed closer, arms sliding around Shadow's thick neck, burying his face in cold matted fur. Tears soaked into the dog's coat, mingling with river water and the faint copper scent of blood. "I'll help you remember," he whispered into the quiet dark of the shed. I promise I will." For the first time, Shadow didn't flinch away from his touch. His trembling eased his chest, rising and falling in a slow, uneven rhythm. The quiet echo in Ethan's mind pulsed with a single feeling, pure and unguarded. Warmth. Outside, the wind howled down the valley, rattling the tin roof above them, until dust drifted in silver motes through the slanted shafts of morning sun. Ethan didn't notice. He just held Shadow, rocking him gently back and forth, tears still streaming down his flushed cheeks. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time folded in on itself inside that small, dark shed, until nothing existed except a boy and a dog, and the silent promise they wove together from pain and hope. Finally, Shadow stirred under his arms. His head lifted, trembling with effort, until his pale blue eyes met Ethan's again. The echo in Ethan's chest thrummed low, dark with a memory so heavy, it felt like a stone sinking into deep water. "They took us from our homes, from our mothers, from our brothers and sisters. They made us fight, injected us with things that burned, made us strong, made us mean, made us monsters." The last word quivered with such deep self-loathing that Ethan flinched as if slapped. He tightened his grip around Shadow's neck, shaking his head furiously. "You're not a monster," he choked out. "You're not. You're just hurt." Shadow's eyes slid closed. A single low whine rose from his throat, vibrating against Ethan's chest like a cry too old and broken to ever become words. The voice inside Ethan's mind flickered with jagged shards of memory. Dark rooms lit by bare bulbs, the smell of bleach and blood. Men's voices barking orders in Spanish and English, the sharp sting of needles, the hot burn of chemical fire flooding veins, not meant to carry it. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking from under his lashes. He couldn't see it anymore. He didn't want to. But the images kept coming, dogs tearing at each other, in cages too small to stand, and men laughing, the sound of bets exchanged over screams of pain. And through it all, a single feeling: I don't want to hurt anymore. I don't want to hurt anymore. I don't want to hurt anymore. The chant echoed in Ethan's bones until it felt like it was coming from his own heart. He pressed his forehead harder against Shadow's muzzle, voice raw and shaking as he whispered, "You don't have to. You don't have to hurt ever again." Shadow's breathing hitched, rattled, then settled into a low, heavy rhythm. The voice in Ethan's mind flickered with something new, a faint, fragile warmth that trembled with disbelief. "How?" "Because I'm here," Ethan whispered. "I'm here. And I won't ever leave you." For a long moment, the world held its breath. Outside, the wind dropped to a hush. The rattling tin roof fell silent. The shed was filled with only the sound of two hearts beating, one fast and small, the other deep and ragged. Then Shadow sighed a long, shuddering breath that ruffled Ethan's damp hair. The echo in his mind softened the jagged edges, smoothing into something quieter, something that glowed faintly in the dark. "I don't want to be alone anymore." "You're not," Ethan said fiercely. "You're not alone, not ever again." He pulled back just enough to see Shadow's face. The Husky's eyes blinked open, heavy with exhaustion. But in their pale blue depths, Ethan saw a flicker of trust. A tiny, fragile spark buried under layers of pain and terror and rage. But it was there. Shadow's lips twitched again. Not a snarl, not a tremor of pain. Almost a smile. The echo in Ethan's chest vibrated with a single word: "Friend." Ethan let out a sob that turned into a broken laugh. He hugged Shadow tighter, burying his face in the Husky's neck, feeling the faint warmth of life pulsing under battered skin. Tears soaked into matted fur. His shoulders shook with silent cries that had no sound. Outside, the sun rose higher over the mountains, sending pale golden beams through the cracked wood slats of the shed. They fell across boy and dog, painting them in stripes of light and shadow. Dust motes danced in the quiet air, tiny fragments of silver and gold spinning in lazy spirals around them. In that moment, Ethan felt it, the invisible thread weaving between his small, trembling heart and Shadow's vast, wounded soul. A bond forged not in words or promises, but in pain shared and comfort offered, in tears shed for someone else's wounds, in the quiet certainty of love given without condition. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know how to keep Shadow safe. He didn't know how to heal the wounds that went deeper than flesh. But as he sat there holding the trembling Husky in the dim morning light, he knew one thing with absolute, unbreakable certainty: they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, Shadow's dreams were quiet. Ethan sat cross-legged on the dirt floor of the old shed, leaning against a stack of dry cedar planks, eyes fixed on Shadow as the Husky lay curled under the worn horse blanket. Afternoon light filtered through the slats in golden beams, catching in the swirling dust motes that drifted between them. Shadow's breathing had calmed since morning. His ribs still showed sharp under his matted fur, but his eyes stayed open longer each time he woke, pale blue and cloudy with exhaustion, yet sharper now, watchful. A mind returning from the fog. Ethan held a battered spiral notebook in his lap, the pages smudged with fingerprints and pencil graphite. In shaky letters he had written Shadow's story. Below it, he began to list every scar he saw, every wound he cleaned, every quiet whimper Shadow made as he worked. But now he sat silently, pencil limp in his grip, staring at the Husky as the shadows lengthened outside. Shadow shifted under the blanket. His tail thumped weakly against the dirt. He turned his head to look at Ethan, ears twitching at a distant sound only he could hear. "Why are you doing this?" The voice came again, echoing not in Ethan's ears, but in his chest, deep and resonant, like thunder rolling over plains. Ethan swallowed, blinking back tears that always seemed close now. "Because you need me," he whispered. Shadow's gaze softened. His cracked lips parted, but no sound emerged. The voice in Ethan's chest vibrated low with sadness. "No one has ever needed me like this, only feared me." Ethan shook his head. "I don't fear you." Silence fell between them. A silence filled with unspoken truths and distant regrets. Outside, the shed door rattled gently in the wind. Somewhere near the porch, Grandpa James's hammer struck wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each strike vibrated through the ground, steady as a heartbeat. Then Shadow's eyes sharpened. His ears pricked forward, nose twitching, as if catching a scent on a breeze no one else could feel. Ethan watched him carefully, the pencil falling from his fingers onto the dirt with a soft thud. "I need to tell you something." Shadow's voice rumbled inside him, so sudden and fierce that Ethan jerked back against the cedar planks. "What is it?" he whispered, leaning forward again, eyes wide. Shadow shifted his weight, groaning softly as he stretched his forelegs out from under the blanket. His paws were raw and cracked pads torn and scabbed. Ethan reached out and cupped one gently in his small hands, rubbing a thumb across the rough, scarred skin. Shadow closed his eyes, breathing in slow and ragged. When he spoke again, the words felt heavier, darker, like black clouds gathering on the horizon. There's a place near the border, South Texas. They call it El Matadero, the slaughterhouse. Ethan's pulse quickened. His breath hitched in his chest. What? What is it, he asked, though he could already feel the answer forming in the cold hollow of his stomach. Where they took us? Where they trained us? Where they made us fight? Images flooded Ethan's mind. Before Shadow could finish, rusted iron cages stacked in rows. Dozens of dogs pacing in circles, their eyes glassy and wild. Men with long knives strapped to their thighs, voices barking commands in a language Ethan did not know but understood all the same anger, domination, cruelty. He saw a wide pit dug into the ground, ringed with wire fencing and metal bleachers under corrugated tin roofs. Inside the pit, blood stained the sand dark brown. Dogs lunged at each other, foam flying from snarling jaws, claws ripping fur and flesh. Men cheered. Money changed hands. Screams echoed under bare light bulbs strung from the rafters like lanterns in a nightmare. Ethan gasped, clutching Shadow's paw tighter. Tears spilled down his cheeks, dripping onto the Husky's fur. "They made you fight there," he choked out. Shadow's eyes opened glassy with pain. His voice inside Ethan's chest shook with remembered terror. "We fought or we died. They pumped us full of chemicals that burned like fire in our blood. Made us faster, stronger, angrier. If we lost, they threw us away. Into the river, into pits. Left us to rot." Ethan doubled over, pressing his forehead to Shadow's paw. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. His small chest heaved as he sucked in desperate breaths between cries. Shadow shifted closer, nudging his cold nose against Ethan's wet cheek. The quiet echo of his voice trembled with something like apology. "Don't cry for me, little one. Cry for the others, the ones still there." Ethan's sobs stilled. Slowly he lifted his head. Tears clung to his eyelashes, his face blotchy and red. He stared into Shadow's pale blue eyes, seeing not just pain there, but pleading. "Others?" he whispered. "There are more." Shadow blinked slowly, exhaustion dragging at his eyelids, but he forced them open again, locking onto Ethan's gaze with fierce intensity. "Hundreds. Taken from homes, from shelters, from streets, pumped full of chemicals, forced to fight. They are still there, Ethan. Still dying. Every day." The boy felt something ignite inside him. Then something hot and bright and terrible. He clenched his small fists until his nails bit crescents into his palms. "Then we have to stop them," he whispered, voice trembling with a rage so deep it scared him. "We have to stop them, Shadow." Shadow closed his eyes again, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at the corners of his cracked lips. His voice in Ethan's chest was quiet, almost tender. "How?" Ethan sat back on his heels, wiping tears from his face with the sleeve of his sweatshirt. He glanced around the shed, eyes darting over rusty tools, old crates, cracked lanterns. His mind felt like lightning, bright and wild, leaping from thought to thought until it landed on a single clear idea. "We show them," he said. His voice grew stronger, steadier. "We show the world what they're doing. People won't let it keep happening if they see it. They'll stop it." Shadow's ears twitched. His breathing hitched, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The echo of his voice inside Ethan's chest was faint, but filled with wonder. "You would risk yourself? For them?" Ethan nodded fiercely. "They're like you. They're friends, even if I never met them. And friends protect each other." Shadow's eyes closed, a single tear sliding down his scarred cheek into the dirt below. His chest shivered with a long, rattling sigh. "Then tell me, what do we do?" Ethan pushed himself to his feet, legs trembling with adrenaline. He brushed dirt from his knees and walked to the corner of the shed where his small blue backpack hung from a rusted nail. He unzipped the side pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope stuffed with wrinkled bills and coins. His recycling money, birthday money, crumpled $5 bills from Grandpa for shoveling snow last winter. Everything he'd saved for a new bike. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the promise it had carried for months. Then he glanced back at Shadow, lying battered and broken under the horse blanket, eyes half closed, but watching him with a trust so fragile it might shatter under a single careless breath. Ethan closed his fingers around the envelope. The bike could wait. The electronics store smelled of plastic and ozone, sharp and artificial under humming fluorescent lights. Ethan wandered the aisles, clutching his envelope tightly against his chest. His eyes scanned shelves stacked with cameras, headphones, radios, televisions flickering silently with football games and cooking shows. Finally, he found it. A small glass case near the front registers filled with miniature cameras in bright packaging GoPro Hero Mini. The price tag stabbed into his chest like a blade. He counted his money twice. It wasn't enough. Panic rose, tightening his throat, but then he remembered the jar of quarters in Grandpa's workbench drawer, saved for gas money in emergencies. This was an emergency. He approached the cashier, an older teenager with acne scars and bleached hair that flopped over his eyes. The boy barely looked up as Ethan placed his crumpled bills on the counter. "You want the warranty, kid?" he asked in a bored drawl. Ethan shook his head. "No, just the camera." The cashier scanned it, punched in numbers, stuffed it into a thin plastic bag, and shoved it across the counter. "Receipt's in the bag. Next." Ethan clutched it to his chest and ran out the sliding glass doors into the biting wind. The sun was setting, flooding the horizon with molten orange and bruised purple. He ran all the way home, lungs burning, eyes stinging with cold, and tears, and something else he couldn't name. Fear and hope braided together so tight it hurt. Grandpa James was on the porch when Ethan returned, his thick arms crossed over his chest, eyes shadowed under his Rockies cap. He watched silently as Ethan slowed to a walk, panting, hair whipped into wild tangles by the wind. "Where you been?" Peanut, his voice was low, wary. Ethan stopped at the foot of the porch steps. His small shoulders trembled as he clutched the bag to his chest. Tears welled up again, unbidden, blurring Grandpa's lined, weathered face. I had to get something," he whispered. Grandpa's eyes narrowed. He stepped down and took the bag from Ethan's numb fingers. He pulled out the camera, turning it over in his big hands. His brow furrowed deeper. "Ethan, what's this for?" The boy shook his head, choking on a sob. He didn't know how to explain. Didn't know how to tell him about Shadow's voice in his chest, about the cages and the fighting pits and the river stained red. Didn't know how to say that he couldn't sit here and do nothing while dogs like Shadow bled and died in the dark. Tears spilled down his cheeks. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. "Please, Grandpa," he cried softly. "Please, I have to help them." For a long, silent moment, Grandpa James just stood there staring at him, with eyes that burned with questions and a quiet, deep fear. Then slowly, he set the camera back into the bag, folded the thin plastic handles over Ethan's small fingers, and placed his broad, calloused hand on the boy's trembling shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask. He just stood there, the dying light of day washing over them both, and squeezed Ethan's shoulder gently, once firmly, like an anchor dropped into stormy water. And in that silent promise, Ethan felt the first thread of hope, knot tight and unbreakable, inside his chest. The sun sank behind the mountains in a wash of dying gold, leaving the valley in deepening shades of violet and indigo. Shadows lengthened across the yard as Ethan sat curled on the shed floor, knees pressed tight to his chest forehead, resting on his trembling arms. His breath came in ragged little huffs that fogged in the cold air. Night was falling fast, bringing with it the bone-deep chill of October. Beside him, Shadow paced restlessly. His paws whispered across the dirt floor claws, ticking softly on the rough boards, where they poked through loose earth. Ethan watched him move, heart squeezing tighter with every silent step. The GoPro harness was strapped snug around Shadow's broad chest. Ethan had tested it earlier, pressing the record button with shaking fingers, watching the tiny red light flicker on. He had checked the angle again and again, until his eyes burned from squinting at the small black screen. The footage was clear as Shadow's point of view, each movement smooth and silent. The world from the height of a husky's eyes. Now the camera blinked steadily against Shadow's silver fur, each pulse of red reflecting off the damp black of his nose as he turned back to look at Ethan. "Are you sure about this, little one?" The voice rumbled inside Ethan's chest, low and trembling with worry. He swallowed hard, lifting his tear-bright eyes to meet Shadow's pale blue gaze. "I have to be," he whispered, voice cracking. "They have to see. The world has to see." Shadow paused in his pacing. His ears twitched back then forward again. Outside, a cold wind rattled the tin roof, whistling through the gaps in the boards, sending thin fingers of icy air curling around Ethan's ankles. Shadow stepped closer, lowering his massive head until his muzzle brushed against the boy's cheek. "You're brave," he murmured in that silent place between them. "Braver than anyone I've ever known." Ethan closed his eyes, tears spilling over to soak into Shadow's fur. He reached up with trembling fingers and touched the side of the husky's face, feeling the warmth there, the faint quiver of muscle beneath thin skin. "Promise me you'll come back," he whispered. His voice was so small it barely carried past his lips. Shadow didn't answer. Instead, he nuzzled Ethan's hair, breathing in deep, as if memorizing the boy's scent. Then he turned, stepping lightly across the dirt floor, paws silent as shadows themselves. He paused at the doorway, head low, ears flat against his skull. Outside, the last traces of daylight clung to the tops of the cottonwoods like dying embers. Beyond them lay the forest, dark, deep, and waiting. "Stay here," Shadow's voice whispered in Ethan's chest. "Stay safe." Then he slipped out into the gathering night, silver fur disappearing into darkness, so complete it swallowed him whole. Ethan sat frozen, long after Shadow was gone, staring at the empty doorway. The wind rattled the shed walls. A thin wail rose from somewhere deep in the woods, coyotes calling to each other across unseen distances. The boy shivered and pulled his knees tighter to his chest. "Please," he whispered into the silent dark, "please keep him safe." His fingers twisted together, knuckles white with strain. He closed his eyes and prayed, not to God, not exactly, but to something older, something deeper, the quiet force that lived under his ribs and in the spaces between his thoughts. The same force that whispered in Shadow's voice, that bound them together like blood and bone. "Please," he whispered again, tears slipping down his cheeks to fall onto his clasped hands. "Please bring him back." Shadow moved through the trees like a ghost. His paws skimmed fallen leaves, his claws clicked softly over roots and rocks, but no sound rose loud enough to disturb the night. The GoPro blinked steadily against his chest, casting tiny red flashes across low branches as he passed. The forest was alive with shadows, and quiet sounds, the scurry of a vole beneath dry grass, the hoot of an owl hunting from a high pine, the whisper of wind threading through dark needles. Shadow paid them no mind. His ears were tuned forward, catching only the faint echoes of distant voices rising over the tree line. Ahead, lights glowed between the black trunks. Yellow and harsh, they flickered from naked bulbs strung across a wide clearing. Beyond the trees, a fence of rusted corrugated metal rose 8 feet tall, its top coiled with barbed wire that gleamed silver under floodlights. Shadow crouched low, belly brushing damp moss as he crept to the edge of the tree line. His ears twitched, nose lifting to scent the cold night air. Diesel fumes burned meat dog sweat, blood, ammonia iron. The smells burned his nostrils and stirred a hot, choking panic in his chest. Memories crashed over him in jagged waves, snarling jaws dripping with blood, sharp pain as teeth closed around his throat, the roar of men's voices screaming for blood, the sting of a baton across his spine when he faltered. Shadow shook his head, forcing the visions back. He blinked once, twice, focusing his mind on the world before him now. The GoPro pressed against his chest, recording each small tremor of his muscles, each flick of his ears, as he gathered every detail. For Ethan, he told himself. For the others. He crept forward. Inside the compound, chain-link kennels lined the fence line, each one just large enough for a dog to stand in. Dozens of cages stretched away under floodlights, their thin wire floors sagging under the shifting weight of wasted bodies. Shadows slunk between shadows, weaving around empty plastic barrels and abandoned vehicles rusting under tarps. The GoPro recorded it all, ribs pressing against thin fur dogs with eyes crusted shut, ears torn and bleeding. Muzzles smeared with blood saliva foaming thick at the corners of their mouths. Tails tucked so tight against bellies, they almost disappeared. He passed a black pit bull curled against the chain link, shaking violently, her breath coming in ragged wheezes. A brindle mastiff lifted his massive head as Shadow passed eyes dull with pain, then laid it back down on his forepaws with a quiet whimper. Shadow's chest vibrated with a low, mournful growl. His lips peeled back in a silent snarl. But he didn't stop. He kept moving. At the far side of the compound, near the largest floodlight, men stood in a loose circle around a skinny brown dog with wide, terrified eyes. A trainer in a leather vest crouched before the dog, holding its muzzle closed with a thick, gloved hand. In his other hand, he held a syringe filled with a cloudy yellow liquid. Shadow froze behind a stack of old tires. Ears pricked forward, heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The man jabbed the needle into the dog's hind leg. The animal jerked, yelped softly, and tried to pull away. But another man grabbed its collar, yanking it back hard enough to choke off the sound. Foam bubbled at the corners of its mouth as the drug coursed through its veins. Its eyes rolled back and its legs trembled so violently they nearly gave out. The trainer stood wiping the syringe against his jeans before tossing it onto the dirt. He spat a long stream of tobacco juice beside the whimpering dog. 10 minutes, he said in Spanish, voice low and flat. Then he goes in the ring. The men chuckled softly, the sound curling into the night like snakes through grass. They moved away, leaving the brown dog standing alone, swaying on trembling legs. Its chest heaved, eyes glassy and unfocused mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Shadow's lips curled back in a snarl so deep it rumbled through his entire body. Rage burned in his chest, a hot white fire that seared every thought from his mind. But then Ethan's voice echoed in his memory, quiet and strong. "We have to show them. They have to see." He forced the growl back down into his chest, forced his paws to keep moving, forced his mind to focus on the mission. The camera blinked steadily against his chest, capturing every flickering light, every trembling paw, every broken gaze. In the center of the compound lay the fighting pit. A wide circle of packed dirt ringed with corrugated metal walls, 8 feet tall. Floodlights blazed down into it, illuminating dark stains in the earth. Old blood fresh, blood urine mud. 2 dogs circled each other within the pit, both panting heavily, foam dripping from their jaws. One was a white pit bull, the other a brindle boxer mix. Both bore fresh wounds that gleamed wet under the lights. Their eyes rolled with pain and fury, whites showing in stark crescents. Around the rim, men shouted and cheered, waving wads of cash. Slapping each other's shoulders, smoke curling from cigarettes held between yellow teeth. A tall man in a cowboy hat leaned over the railing, shouting something Ethan couldn't understand, but Shadow knew all too well. "Kill him!" Rip his throat out. The dogs lunged. The pit bull caught the boxer's ear, tore it half off. Blood sprayed in a bright arc, splattering the metal walls. The boxer screamed a high, human-like wail that rose over the men's cheers. Shadow squeezed his eyes shut. His chest heaved. The camera recorded everything, blinking steadily under the screaming lights. He turned away, paws trembling so violently he nearly stumbled. He moved along the back fence, nose low to the ground, ears pinned flat against his skull. At the far corner, a tall chain-link gate hung slightly ajar. Beyond it lay a field of dark grass rolling away into the night. Shadow paused, head turning back over his shoulder. The cries of the boxers still echoed under the floodlights, mingled with the roar of men's voices and the harsh electric buzz of the lights. For Ethan, he told himself again, for the others. Then he slipped through the gate and vanished into the dark. Back in the shed, Ethan sat with his eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking between his lashes, dripping onto the dirt floor below. His small hands were clasped tight around the GoPro receiver screen, watching every flickering image as it streamed live from Shadow's camera. His chest hurt so badly he could barely breathe. "Please," he whispered into the silent night. "Please come home." Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof. The coyotes howled again somewhere far away, their voices rising and falling in mournful chorus. And in the dark between the trees, Shadow ran through moonlit grass and silent pines, the camera blinking like a single red star against the endless black of night. The fighting pit roared behind him, echoing with cheers and screams that rose into the cold night air like a chant to dark gods. Shadow moved through the shadows beyond the chain-link gate, his paws silent on the packed dirt breath coming in low, ragged gasps. The GoPro pulsed against his chest, each blink of red, slicing the darkness with tiny flashes of warning. His ears flicked back, catching the sound of footsteps crunching gravel behind him. Fast, heavy, human. He froze, head-lowering hackles rising along his neck. The scent reached him a moment later, motor oil, stale beer, sweat soaked into denim. The guard. "Qui coraggio!" "Who the hell let you out here?" the man growled. His boots scraped the dirt as he stepped closer. Flashlight beams slicing through the dark to land on Shadow's silver-gray coat. The man's squinted eyes narrowing, then widening in confusion as they landed on the small black camera strapped to Shadow's chest. "What the?" Shadow didn't move. He forced himself to stand still, muscles quivering with restraint. The GoPro recorded it all, the man's tanned face under the shadow of a ball cap, the stubble lining his jaw, the dark snake tattoo curling around his throat. The guard stepped forward, his boots thudding close enough that Shadow could smell the garlic on his breath. "You got something on you, boy," he muttered, reaching out with a thick-fingered hand. His calloused thumb brushed the camera's plastic casing, jiggling it slightly. The red light blinked directly into his eyes. Shadow's chest rumbled with a low growl he couldn't suppress. The man froze, eyes flicking up to meet Shadow's pale blue stare. The Husky bared his teeth in a silent snarl. His lip curled back, revealing long canines that gleamed in the dim floodlight glow. The man's fingers tightened around the camera harness, yanking at the strap. "What is this?" he hissed. "A tracker. A bomb. Fucking dog." He ripped the camera free. The harness snapped the GoPro, falling into his palm. The red light continued to blink steadily as the man turned it over, eyes scanning its shape with growing realization. "Shit," he breathed. He turned his head, shouting over his shoulder toward the kennel rows. "Carlos! Oye, Carlos! Tenemos un puto problema aquí!" Shadow lunged. He moved faster than the man could track. His jaws snapped around the guard's wrist, crushing bone with a wet crunch that vibrated up Shadow's skull. Blood sprayed in a hot arc across his muzzle. The man screamed a raw, ragged sound that cut through the compound like a siren. Shadow tore sideways, wrenching his head back and forth, shaking his jaws until the GoPro clattered from the man's fingers onto the dirt. The camera landed facing upward, capturing the guard's face twisted in pain, his mouth open in a wordless howl as Shadow's teeth ripped through tendons and veins. Then Shadow released him, blood dripping from his jaws, and spun away. "Stop him!" someone screamed in Spanish. "Disparale!" A gun cocked. Boots thundered across gravel and packed earth. Shadow bolted paws, skidding in blood-slicked dirt as he sprinted for the fence. Behind him, the injured guard cradled his shredded wrist against his chest, blood streaming between his fingers. Shadows flickered in the floodlights as two more men came running, pistols raised, barrels gleaming black under cold electric glow. Shadow leapt onto an old steel barrel propped against the fence claws, scraping loud against rusted metal. He gathered his legs under him, bunching powerful muscles for a single desperate bound. His breath tore ragged from his lungs, his heart a war drum pounding against cracked ribs. Then the gun fired. The bullet struck his hind leg, just above the hock, punching through fur and flesh and bone with a sharp, wet crack. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and blinding, searing up his spine until his vision blackened at the edges. He stumbled, claws scrambling against the rim of the barrel, blood spraying in an arc across the corrugated fence. Another gunshot rang out, sparking off metal inches from his chest. Snarling, he shoved off with his uninjured legs, muscles screaming in agony. He hit the top of the fence with his shoulders barbed wire, ripping long, burning gashes across his back and flanks. For one suspended instant, he felt the cool night wind whip through his fur, carrying the tang of pine and wet earth. Then he twisted his body sideways, tucking his wounded leg against his belly, and fell. He landed hard on the far side, collapsing into gravel and dead weeds. His wounded leg crumpled under him, white-hot pain, tearing a howl from his throat. But he forced himself up, staggering to his feet, blood pouring down his flank in hot, sticky rivulets. Behind him, men shouted, boots thudded against metal gun barrels, clattered against chain link as they scrambled to follow. Shadow limped into the darkness. Each step jarred the shattered bones, sending lightning bolts of pain shooting through his nerves. His breath came in short, ragged pants. The smell of his own blood filled his nostrils, hot and metallic and thick with terror. "Run," he told himself with each pounding heartbeat. "Run. For Ethan. For them." Miles away, back in the shed, Ethan clutched his phone so tight his fingers cramped around the plastic case. The screen flickered with grainy footage, a blurred face looming close. Shadow's teeth flashing the scream, the chaos, the ground spinning wildly. Then it stabilized for a single heart-stopping second, Shadow limping through a dark field under a sky full of ragged black clouds. The camera angle shook with every uneven stride, each jolt sending bright blurs of pain-broken images across the screen. Then the feed went dark. Connection lost. "No," Ethan screamed. The phone slipped from his hands, clattering onto the dirt floor. He doubled over, clutching his stomach as sobs ripped from his chest. Tears blurred his vision until the world dissolved into streaks of color and darkness. "Please," he sobbed into the cold night air, voice cracking with anguish. "Please don't die. Please don't die. Please don't leave me." The shed was silent, except for his ragged weeping. Outside, the wind howled down the valley, rattling the tin roof like distant thunder. In the darkness beyond the cottonwoods, the night swallowed every sound, leaving only Ethan's quiet, broken prayer hanging in the cold air. "Please come back to me. Please, Shadow. Please come home." Shadow's vision blurred with every step. His breath tore through his lungs in ragged gasps. Blood dripped steadily from the wound in his leg, each drop darkening the grass beneath him. The forest closed around him, black trunks looming, tall branches clawing at his flanks as he staggered past. The moon hid behind thick storm clouds, plunging the woods into a darkness so deep it felt like drowning. But he kept moving. One step, then another. Each jolt sent pain lancing up his spine. Each breath burned hot in his throat, but he didn't stop. For Ethan, he told himself with each pounding heartbeat. For Ethan, for Ethan, for Ethan. Behind him, voices shouted in Spanish, dogs barked, men crashed through undergrowth with flashlights slashing the night. Gunshots cracked each one, sending panic jolting through his chest. But the bullets missed. The men fell further behind as the forest thickened, roots and brambles tangling around their boots, branches whipping their faces. Shadow slipped through it all, like smoke through a broken wall. His legs trembled with exhaustion, his vision narrowed to a thin tunnel of moonlit grass and dark earth. Every nerve burned with pain, every breath rattled with exhaustion. But he kept moving, because stopping meant death. And death meant failure. Failure to Ethan. Failure to the hundreds of dogs still trapped behind those fences. Failure to himself. He stumbled over a root, collapsing onto his injured side. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and searing. He gasped, jaws parting in a silent scream, teeth snapping shut on empty air. For a moment, darkness closed in around him, warm and quiet, promising peace, rest, and end to the agony. But then Ethan's voice echoed inside him so clear and bright, it cut through the pain, like sunlight breaking storm clouds. "Promise me you'll come back." Shadow groaned low in his chest. He dug his claws into the cold, damp earth, dragging himself upright. His injured leg shook violently under him, blood dripping steadily into the grass, but he forced it to bear his weight, forced it to hold him as he stumbled forward again. Step, step, step for Ethan. Step, step, step for them. Step, step, step. Behind him, the men's voices faded into distant echoes. The dog's barking grew muffled, swallowed by dark trees and rising wind. Ahead through the black forest, a faint light glowed. The shed. Home. Shadow lowered his head and limped toward it, each step burning each breath, scraping his throat raw. But he kept going, the echo of Ethan's voice carrying him forward, guiding him home through the endless dark. Shadow's paws tore through fallen leaves and cold mud as he limped through the forest, each step sending pain lancing up his shattered leg. His lungs burned with ragged gasps, the taste of iron thick in his throat. Blood dripped steadily from the wound, painting the damp ground with a trail that gleamed black in moonlight, slicing through the trees. Branches lashed his flanks, snagging in matted fur. The world blurred around him, dark trunks flickering past in jagged shadows. His ears pinned back to block out the pounding of his own heart, the roar of pain in his skull. But through it all, another sound cut sharp and clear into his mind, vibrating down to the marrow of his bones. "Shadow, please, come back to me." Ethan's voice, small and cracked with tears. Not a command, not an order like the men who broke him. Just a plea, fragile, human, real. Shadow stumbled over an exposed root, collapsing chest first into wet leaves. His injured leg folded under him, agony exploding behind his eyes in a burst of white. For a moment, the darkness pressed down, thick and heavy, whispering to him, "Stay, rest, let go." But Ethan's voice came again, shivering with grief and hope, all tangled into one desperate breath. "Please, please don't leave me." A low whine slipped from Shadow's chest. He pressed his nose into the cold earth, breathing in the sharp scent of pine needles and frozen moss. The forest was silent, except for the distant roar of the river beyond the ridgeline. Then came another sound. Voices, harsh, barked in Spanish. Footsteps crunching dead leaves. Flashlights cut through the trees behind him, slicing golden beams through the black trunks. The men were close, too close. Shadow forced his head up ears, straining to track the voices. Pain lanced through his skull as he moved. He staggered back to his feet, injured leg trembling violently under his weight. Blood streamed down his flank in hot rivulets, steaming where it touched the frozen ground. The men shouted again, closer now. He could smell them. Cigarette smoke, gun oil, leather and sweat. Panic flared in his chest, thick and suffocating, dragging his thoughts back into old cages, to snarling dogs and metal walls slick with blood. "Run!" The voice was not Ethan's. It was his own, deep and primal, older than the injections, older than commands. The voice of survival. Shadow limped forward, dragging his leg behind him, each step a burst of searing white agony. The trees thinned as he reached the edge of the forest. Beyond lay the river, wide and black under the fractured moon. Its surface rippled with eddies of silver and shadow. The current whispered cold promises. He heard the men break from the tree line behind him. Spanish curses slashed the quiet. A flashlight beam swung across the undergrowth, catching his silhouette as he hobbled into open ground. "Allí, perro, hijo de puta." Gunshots cracked, shattering the silent valley. Bullets tore into the dirt around his paws, spraying frozen mud against his chest and muzzle. He jerked sideways, nearly collapsing again, claws scrabbling for purchase in the soft riverbank. Another shot rang out the bullet, whistling past his ears, so close he felt its wind. Shadow turned, lips peeling back in a silent snarl. 3 men sprinted down the slope toward him. One carried a pistol, the other 2 brandished long iron bars. Their boots tore through dead grass and soft earth as they charged, eyes narrowed under black baseball caps. For Ethan, Shadow lunged. The first man swung his baton, metal whistling through the air. Shadow dropped low, pain screaming through his bad leg as he pushed off his good paw. His jaws clamped around the man's calf. Bone crunched under his teeth, warm blood flooding his mouth with copper heat. The man screamed, collapsing sideways. Shadow let go, twisting, just as another baton cracked against his ribs with enough force to knock him off his paws. Stars exploded behind his eyes. He hit the ground hard, air blasting from his lungs in a hoarse yelp. The third man aimed his pistol finger, tightening on the trigger. Shadow saw the barrel rise black and endless under the moonlight. Saw the man's eyes gleam with triumph. Time slowed to a thick syrup. Then Ethan's voice came again, soft and clear, curling into the silent space between heartbeats. "Please, Shadow, come home." Rage flared white-hot in his chest. His jaws snapped up, clamping down on the baton, striking his shoulder. Metal shrieked against his teeth as he ripped it from the man's grip. He spun, using the momentum to throw his entire weight into the gunman's legs. They crashed to the ground together. The pistol fired into the night sky, muzzle flash, searing the darkness with white fire. Shadow bit down on the man's wrist teeth, slicing through tendon and flesh. The man screamed, dropping the gun. Shadow released him, staggering sideways, head spinning with pain and adrenaline. Another shot cracked. Heat bloomed across Shadow's shoulder. He stumbled, nearly falling into the mud, his vision going black at the edges. A scream rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down. There was no time. No time for pain. The river roared before him, black and deep and swift. The current seethed with broken moonlight, swirling eddies curling into dark mouths. He limped forward, dragging his shattered leg behind him. Each step felt like knives slicing into bone. Behind him, the men regrouped, shouting curses, scrabbling for their fallen weapons. "Mátalo, dispárale ya." The pistol fired again. The bullet punched through the dirt inches from his paws, spraying cold mud across his chest. Shadow didn't slow. He reached the edge of the bank and paused, chest-heaving blood dripping steadily into the river's black mirror. He turned his head, once ears flicking back, pale blue eyes blazing in the darkness. The men froze, weapons half raised, staring at him across the moonlit grass. For that single breathless instant, no one moved. For Ethan, Shadow lunged forward and leapt off the bank. The freezing water swallowed him instantly, ripping the air from his lungs with a silent scream. The current seized his battered body and spun him into darkness, tumbling him head over paws through cold that burned like fire. His open wounds screamed with agony as icy water filled them, searing exposed nerves. He kicked weakly with his uninjured leg, fighting to keep his muzzle above the roiling black. Water rushed into his mouth and nose, choking him with mud and silt. The river spun him sideways, his vision flickering with darkness and fractured moonlight as he rolled under the surface again. "Please, Shadow, come home." Ethan's voice rang in his chest, bright and thin like a candle in endless night. Shadow's paws clawed at the current legs, trembling with exhaustion. The wound in his hind leg burned with every kick, each movement tearing the shattered bone further apart. The river's current grabbed him again, pulling him deeper into its cold embrace. He felt himself sinking, pause, reaching for a bottom that never came. Darkness closed over his eyes, quiet and soft and final. But Ethan's voice came again, warm and golden against the freezing black. "Please, don't leave me." Shadow's chest heaved with a final desperate breath. His paws kicked once, twice, thrashing against the current. His muzzle broke the surface for a single heartbeat. Cold air filled his lungs, burning like fire. Moonlight shattered across his eyes in brilliant silver shards. Then the river pulled him under again. Back in the shed, Ethan sat curled in the dirt, the GoPro feed long gone to black. His phone lay on the ground beside him, the screen cracked from where he had thrown it in panic. Tears streamed silently down his cheeks, dripping onto the folded blanket in his lap. "Please," he whispered into the empty, dark voice, cracking with grief. "Please come home. Please don't leave me alone." The wind rattled the shed walls. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled its lonely cry, curling through the cold October night. Ethan closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to his knees. In the silent space between his sobs, he thought he felt it, a faint flicker at the edge of his mind. Weak, fading. But there. "For you, Ethan, for you." Shadow drifted down through the river's black coils, his body limp, blood seeping in thin red ribbons that curled into darkness. His eyes flickered open one last time. Through the rippling water above, he saw the fractured glow of the moon, silver and silent, watching him sink. And in the darkness, pressing close around him, he clung to the single thread of gold that bound him to life. Ethan's voice, Ethan's hope, Ethan's love. Ethan. He kicked once, twice, fighting to rise, fighting to breathe, fighting to live, for Ethan. The dawn broke over the Denver foothills in a wash of pale gray and bruised lavender. The kind of dawn that arrived quiet and heavy, pressing down with the weight of secrets unspoken. Frost clung to the grass in delicate silver webs. The river lay dark and silent under the thinning night, its black coils gliding past cottonwoods, bare of their golden leaves. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard, his small frame trembling in the bitter chill. He wore his old green sweatshirt with holes in the elbows, jeans 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with twine. His hair was tangled with sleep cheeks flushed raw from crying. Beside him, Grandpa James finished lacing up his scuffed leather boots, hands moving with slow, steady purpose. "You ready?" Peanut Grandpa asked softly. His deep voice rumbled through the morning stillness, but even its strength carried cracks this dawn could not hide. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. His throat burned with unshed tears. The words stuck like thorns behind his tongue. His eyes stared into the dark line of trees where the forest swallowed the world, searching for silver fur flickering between shadows. But there was nothing. Just silence and the quiet rasp of his own ragged breathing. Grandpa stood, joints popping under his weight. He reached out and rested his broad, calloused hand on Ethan's small shoulder. The warmth of it sank through the boy's thin shirt, trembling down into his bones. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned into it for a heartbeat. Just one. "Let's bring your friend home," Grandpa said, voice rough with something deeper than cold. They walked into the forest together. The cottonwoods towered above them, like silent sentinels, their bare branches rattling in the breeze. Frost crunched under Grandpa's boots, under Ethan's worn sneakers. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, old river mud. Each breath stung Ethan's lungs with bitter clarity, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him from drowning in the panic clawing at his chest. They followed the trail Shadow had left. Dark smears painted across fallen leaves splashed onto moss-covered roots. Drops of blood glistened bright red in the dawn light, like beads of ruby strung along the forest floor. Each one made Ethan's stomach twist tighter, his eyes blur with tears that froze against his lashes. "Steady, son," Grandpa murmured behind him. "We'll find him." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were gone, burned away, by the single silent scream echoing in his chest. "Please be alive. Please be alive. Please be alive." They reached the river, just as the sun cracked above the ridgeline, bleeding pale gold across the trembling black water. The current was slower here, curling around a wide bend, where fallen cottonwoods stretched broken branches into the shallows. Frost limned every exposed root and branch tip in silver-white lace. Ethan scanned the shoreline with wide, desperate eyes. His breath came in short, harsh gasps. The world tilted around him, colors swimming together in a dizzy wash of dawn and shadow. Then he saw it. A shape lay half submerged in the shallows, tangled in river grass. Silver fur glistened wet and dark under a crust of frost. One hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, blood staining the water in lazy crimson spirals. The river whispered around the still body, nudging it gently with each passing current, as if trying to wake it. Ethan's scream tore through the silent valley, sharp and ragged, ripping from his chest with the force of breaking bones. Shadow. He ran forward, feet slipping on frozen mud. Grandpa's hand snatched at his shoulder, but missed. Ethan stumbled down the bank, knees cracking against hidden stones, pain flaring up his shins. He didn't feel it. He crashed into the shallows, icy water soaking his jeans to the thighs, biting deep into his skin. His hands plunged into the freezing river, grasping at wet fur, fingers sliding over blood-slicked flesh. "Shadow, please, please, wake up, please." His voice broke into hiccuped sobs. Tears poured down his cheeks, mixing with the river water as he pressed his face against Shadow's neck. The Husky didn't move. His chest was still, his head twisted sideways, jaws half open to reveal broken, blood-stained teeth. Frost clung to his muzzle in delicate crystalline flakes. "Please," Ethan whispered, voice trembling so hard the word almost broke apart. "Please don't leave me. Please don't leave me." Behind him, Grandpa James stepped carefully down the bank boots, sinking into the soft, frozen mud with heavy sighs. He paused a few feet away, staring down at the boy, kneeling in the icy river arms, wrapped tight around the broken silver body. For a long, silent moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the quiet rush of the river, the rustle of dry leaves along the bank, the sharp, brittle cracking of ice as Ethan shifted his knees deeper into the water. Then Grandpa let out a long, shuddering sigh. He knelt slowly, joints creaking with age, until he was beside his grandson in the freezing shallows. The cold bit through his jeans, sank deep into bones scarred by years of labor and frostbit winters. But he ignored it. He reached out one large weathered hand and laid it gently on Ethan's small, trembling shoulder. "Peanut," he whispered, voice breaking around the word. He's gone, son." Ethan shook his head violently, tears flying from his lashes. No, he's not. He can't be, he promised. He said he'd come back. His voice dissolved into sobs. He buried his face in Shadow's wet, blood-matted fur, the coppery scent flooding his nose, making him gag with grief. His hands clenched into tight fists around the Husky's ruff, holding on, as if his grip alone could drag Shadow back from wherever he had gone. Grandpa James closed his eyes. Tears pooled beneath his lashes, catching in deep wrinkles carved by decades of sun and wind and silent heartbreaks. One tear slipped free, tracing a slow silver path down his weathered cheek to disappear into his gray beard. He squeezed Ethan's shoulder gently, feeling the thin bones trembling under his palm. The boy's sobs shook through his small frame, each one tearing into Grandpa's chest with the sharp finality of nails driven into old wood. For a long time, they stayed there together in the freezing river, dawn rising around them in a cold, silent blaze. Ethan pressed his face into Shadow's fur, crying so hard his breath came in sharp gasps, his chest heaving under Grandpa's heavy, steady hand. The Husky's body lay limp in his arms. The frost on his muzzle melted under Ethan's hot tears, revealing the silver gray beneath. His pale blue eyes were closed lashes crusted with river silt and salt. His injured leg was twisted awkwardly under his chest, the bullet wound, a dark gaping tear that leaked thick clots into the icy water. Grandpa James bowed his head. His tears fell silently onto Shadow's flank, steaming where they landed on cold, wet fur. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered, voice rough and shaking. "I'm so sorry." The river whispered past them, carrying broken leaves and thin blades of frozen grass downstream into the widening light. A crow called from a dead cottonwood across the bend, its harsh cry splitting the quiet morning like a rusted blade through old bone. Ethan didn't move, his arms clamped tighter around Shadow's neck, pulling the Husky's heavy head against his chest. His tears soaked into thick matted fur, mixing with blood and river water until everything smelled of iron and salt and grief. "Please," he whispered one last time, voice so soft it almost wasn't there at all. "Please come back to me. Please." But there was no answer. Only the river and the dawn and the quiet rattle of dry leaves in the cold October breeze. Grandpa James stayed kneeling beside his grandson until the sun rose high enough to gild the tips of the cottonwoods in pale gold. His knees ached with cold, his breath fogged in ragged plumes. But he didn't move. He just kept his hand on Ethan's shaking shoulder. The boy's quiet sobs echoing through the frost-touched woods like a prayer to something too old and silent to ever answer. Finally, when Ethan's sobs had dulled to silent, trembling gasps, Grandpa slid his arms around the boy's thin chest. Ethan didn't resist as Grandpa pulled him back, holding him against his thick flannel shirt, letting the boy's tears soak into wool and cotton and skin lined with old scars. They sat there together on the muddy bank, the body of the broken Husky half submerged in the black river. Beside them, silver fur swirling in the slow current like drifting ghosts. Grandpa James closed his eyes and pressed his lips to the boy's damp hair. His own tears slipped silently into the tangled strands. "We'll bring him home," he whispered against Ethan's temple. "We'll bury him under the oak where your mama's roses grow. He'll be home, Peanut. He'll be home." Ethan didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on Shadow's still body on the way. The dawn light shimmered across his silver fur, turning each matted clump into a crown of dying stars. His heart ached with a grief so big, it swallowed every other thought. But deep beneath it, flickering like a single hidden ember in black ash, a tiny whisper glowed. "I will never forget you. I will never stop fighting for them. I promise." And the river carried that promise away into the rising sun. The house was silent, except for the quiet hum of Grandpa's old refrigerator and the ticking of the dented wall clock that had belonged to Grandma before she passed. Outside, the first snow of the season fell in silent drifting flakes, layering the porch steps and blanketing the woodpile where Ethan used to sit and talk to Shadow under the pale autumn sun. Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, knees drawn tight to his chest. His hair hung in tangled curls around his face, damp with tears he no longer bothered to wipe away. The tablet screen glowed blue against his pale skin, illuminating dark circles under his eyes. On the cracked screen, the video played again and again. Each loop sent new tears streaming down his cheeks. Shadow's point of view, the kennels, the cages. Dogs pressed against rusted bars, foam dripping from trembling jaws, blood pooling under paws. The fighting pit, slick with gore. Men's voices shouting, laughing, betting. The black mastiff collapsing under the pit bull's savage bite eyes, wide and empty. The brindle boxer staggering on 3 legs, blood spraying from a torn ear. The injection, the screaming, The final desperate sprint, the gunshots, the darkness. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, clutching the tablet so tight his fingers ached. His chest burned with grief so heavy it felt like his ribs might snap under its weight. But beneath that grief burned something sharper, colder. Rage. He swiped away the tears with his sleeve and opened YouTube. His hands shook as he typed in the name he'd chosen, the name Shadow had called him once, in that silent space between their minds. Denver Boy Braveheart. He clicked upload. The spinning wheel turned, biting away tiny seconds of his life seconds, where doubt whispered in his ear, "They won't believe you." But he ignored it. Because it wasn't about him. It was about Shadow. About every dog trapped in that place. About every scream echoing through silent woods at night while the world slept safe and blind. The progress bar reached 100%. The video went live. He didn't tell Grandpa what he'd done. He couldn't find the words. Instead, he left the tablet on the old pine table and walked to the back door. He pushed it open and stepped out into the falling snow. The cold bit deep into his skin, numbing his raw red hands, seeping down into his bones. He walked across the yard to the small stone marker Grandpa had carved 2 days ago. Just a flat piece of slate with Shadow's name scratched into its surface with a carpenter's nail. "Shadow friend, fighter, free." Ethan knelt beside it. Snowflakes fell onto the fresh dirt, melting into dark, wet circles. He placed his small palm against the stone, closing his eyes. The world narrowed to the quiet rush of blood in his ears, the smell of snow and earth and pine sap, the distant caw of a crow calling across the fields. "I did it, Shadow," he whispered. "I showed them. I promise. I'll finish what you started." By midday, the video had been shared 4,000 times. By evening, it reached local Denver news, then national outlets. By dawn the next day, Denver Boy Braveheart was trending worldwide. The footage flickered across every television screen and phone feed, Shadow's POV silent, except for ragged breathing, capturing every bloody cage, every limp, broken body, every injection forced into trembling flanks. The image of the fighting pit burned into the world's collective conscience, dogs tearing at each other under harsh floodlights, while men roared in bloodlust. Comments poured in by the thousands, some short, choked with rage. "Shut them down. This makes me sick." Others long, raw heartbreak, unfiltered. "My dad made me fight pit bulls when I was 8. I still hear them screaming at night. Please, someone stop this. Shadow was a hero. He deserved so much more." Ethan read every comment, tears streaming silently down his face as Grandpa's strong hand rested on his trembling shoulder. That night, while the world watched and waited, the Denver County Sheriff's Office released a statement. Their spokesperson's voice cracked under the weight of what he read. "We are working with federal agencies and animal welfare organizations to investigate what we believe is an interstate dogfighting operation of unprecedented scale." Grandpa squeezed Ethan's shoulder harder. "You did it, Peanut," he whispered, his deep voice shaking. "You did it." But Ethan didn't feel triumph. He only felt hollow, because Shadow wasn't here to see it, to feel it, to run free through the snowy fields behind the house, his silver coat glowing like moonlight. At dawn, 2 days later, police SUVs and unmarked federal vehicles rumbled down a dusty ranch road near Laredo, Texas. News helicopters hovered overhead blades, slicing the cold morning air into roaring vortices that flattened dry grass for miles. On the ground, tactical officers moved in tight formations. Kevlar vests strapped tight across their chests. Animal control vans lined the highway's shoulder engines, idling, white paint gleaming under the rising sun. A news reporter spoke into her mic hair, whipped around her face by the rotor wash. "We are live just north of Laredo, where authorities are executing a multi-state raid on what sources say is the largest illegal dogfighting operation in Texas history." This investigation was sparked by a viral video uploaded by a young boy from Denver, known online as Denver Boy Braveheart, showing disturbing footage from inside this very compound. The feed cut to Shadow's POV footage. Men's faces twisted in rage and bloodlust. Dogs screaming under batons. Injections forced into trembling flesh. The brindle boxer collapsing in the pit. The mastiff's glassy dead eyes staring into darkness. Then back to the reporter, her eyes wet as she swallowed hard, voice trembling. "This is not just an animal cruelty case. This is a tragedy. But today these animals get to go home." Inside the compound, tactical teams moved swiftly between rusted kennels and corrugated metal walls. The fighting pit lay silent and empty, blood frozen to the packed dirt floor. Dogs pressed against cage bars as officers passed, their eyes wide with terror, ribs standing stark under matted fur. Some growled, low muzzles curling back in silent threats born of pain and fear. Others cowered in corners, paws covering their faces, bodies shaking so violently their bones clattered against metal floors. One officer dropped to his knees in front of a filthy crate. Inside lay a golden retriever so thin, its hip bones jutted through golden fur dulled with dirt and dried blood. Its eyes flicked open, cloudy with exhaustion. "Hey there, buddy," the officer whispered, voice breaking as he reached through the bars. "You're okay now. You're safe." The golden retriever blinked slowly. Then, with trembling effort, it lifted its head and pressed its cracked black nose against the officer's gloved hand. Its pink tongue flicked out once, twice, licking his fingers with quiet desperation. The officer choked back a sob. Behind him, the news camera zoomed in. The world watched in silence as the broken dog kissed the hand of its rescuer under the rising Texas sun. Another officer carried a brindle pit bull from a dark corner crate, her body limp in his arms. Her breathing was shallow ribs expanding in small trembling shudders. Her muzzle was taped shut with electrical tape that had torn fur from her face. "Get a medic over here," he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. The medic sprinted over, kneeling beside them with an IV bag already primed. The camera caught it all. The pit bull's wide, terrified eyes, the medic's shaking hands as she inserted the needle, the way the officer held the dog tighter, pressing his forehead to hers. "You're okay now, baby girl," he whispered, tears dripping onto her blood-streaked fur. "You're okay. You're okay." 72 dogs were carried from that compound. 72 broken bodies, wrapped in blankets, lifted in strong, gentle arms. 72 silent hearts that thudded louder with each passing moment of freedom. Police cuffed 8 men, dragging them into waiting vans as news cameras recorded every step. Their heads bowed under baseball caps and cowboy hats, wrists bound behind their backs with zip ties. One shouted curses at the reporters in Spanish. Another wept silently as officers marched him away. The world watched it unfold live. Twitter exploded with tears and rage and hope. "Thank you, Denver boy, Braveheart. Shadow gave his life for them. Never forget him." "I'm crying at work right now watching these dogs get carried out." Ethan sat on Grandpa's lap on the old plaid couch, curled tight into his chest. The TV flickered with footage of officers carrying out dogs one by one. Some lifted their heads, weakly, tongues lolling. Others curled tighter into themselves, eyes squeezed shut against bright morning sun they hadn't seen in months. Grandpa's big hand cupped the back of Ethan's head, pressing his cheek gently against his shoulder. Tears rolled down the old man's face, catching in his gray beard. "You see, Peanut?" he whispered, voice trembling. "You see what you did?" But Ethan didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, wide and glistening, tears falling silently down his cheeks. Because in every trembling paw, in every broken muzzle, in every silent lick against a rescuer's hand, he saw Shadow. And though his heart cracked open with grief so deep it ached down to his bones, something small and fierce glowed in its center. A single truth, a single promise. Shadow hadn't died for nothing. The TV cut to a final shot as dusk fell over the compound. A golden retriever wrapped in a blue fleece blanket lay in the arms of an officer standing beside an animal control van. Its eyes were half-closed, lips curled into the faintest ghost of a smile. The reporter's voice choked with tears as she spoke. "They are calling this one of the largest dogfighting rescues in American history. All thanks to a 6-year-old boy from Denver who refused to let his friend's sacrifice go unseen." Ethan pressed his hand flat against the flickering screen, tears sliding down his chin onto his sweatshirt. "Thank you, Shadow," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of everything he felt and could never say. "Thank you for saving them. I promise I'll never stop fighting for them. I promise." Outside, snow fell silently across the fields, layering the small stone marker with a gentle white shroud. And in the quiet dark, something like hope rose to meet the coming dawn. Snow fell hard through the pale dawn, blanketing Denver in white silence. On the back porch, Ethan huddled inside Grandpa's flannel jacket, knees pulled to his chest. His breath fogged the cold morning air, rising in trembling plumes. In his lap lay Shadow's old leather collar, the metal tag cold and heavy against his fingertips. He turned it over and over in his small hands, tracing the letters stamped into the tarnished brass. Shadow Brave. Each scrape of his fingernail across the rough metal sent tears spilling down his cheeks. He closed his eyes against the blur, pressing the tag hard into his palm until it bit into the tender skin. Until he felt something other than grief. Behind him, the back door creaked open. Grandpa stepped out, boots crunching fresh snow steam curling from his chipped enamel mug of coffee. He watched Ethan for a long, quiet moment, then knelt down beside him. His knees popped, his back cracked, his breath hissed through clenched teeth. But he didn't care. He laid one large weathered hand on Ethan's hunched back. "Peanut," he said softly, his deep voice breaking like old wood under too much weight. You need to come inside now. There's someone here to see you." Ethan didn't move. He just stared down at Shadow's tag tears dripping onto the tarnished metal. Grandpa's hand tightened on his shoulder. "It's Dr. Melinda," he said, voice trembling. "From the clinic." That made Ethan lift his head. Slowly, hope flickered in his chest, a tiny, fragile flame in a storm of grief. He scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over the hem of Grandpa's jacket as he bolted past him into the house. Dr. Melinda stood in the living room, still wearing her scrubs under a long black winter coat dusted with snow. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight braid streaked with gray. Behind her glasses, her blue eyes were rimmed with red, as if she hadn't slept in days. In her arms, wrapped in thick white bandages and a fleece blanket, the color of summer skies, lay Shadow. His silver-gray fur was dulled and matted clumps shaved away to reveal stitched wounds. His back leg was bound in a splint that ran from paw to hip, secured tight with medical tape. A clear plastic cone framed his battered face, and his pale blue eyes were half-lidded with exhaustion and pain. But they were open. Ethan froze in the doorway. His breath hitched in his chest, tears pooling again, blurring the entire world into streaks of color and light. He took one trembling step forward, then another. Then he was running across the room, stumbling over the worn carpet, crashing into Dr. Melinda's side. "Careful, sweetheart," she said, softly shifting Shadow in her arms so Ethan wouldn't bump his injured leg. Her voice cracked as she added, "He made it, Ethan. He's going to be okay." The words slammed into Ethan's chest so hard his knees buckled. He dropped to the carpet at Dr. Melinda's feet, sobs tearing from his throat in silent heaving gasps. He pressed his forehead against Shadow's blanket-wrapped side, clutching the edge of the fleece in trembling fists. Shadow turned his heavy head toward the boy. His tongue flicked out once, licking Ethan's damp hair, weak and slow, but real. His pale blue eyes flickered with something that looked almost like a smile. Ethan's tears streamed down his face, dripping onto Shadow's bandages. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I thought I lost you. I thought you were gone forever." Shadow's chest shivered with a deep, rattling sigh. The cone wobbled slightly as he leaned his muzzle closer, pressing his cold black nose against Ethan's cheek. The voice that rose in Ethan's chest was thin, trembling, but there. "I tried to come home. To you." Ethan sobbed harder. He buried his face in the soft fleece blanket, clutching Shadow's neck so tight, Dr. Melinda had to steady them both to keep from falling. Grandpa James stepped forward, his big hands shaking as he laid them gently on Ethan's shoulders. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks into his beard. His chest heaved with quiet, broken breaths. How did you—" he whispered, looking at Dr. Melinda. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, clearing her throat before answering. "A rancher downriver found him tangled in driftwood near his cattle fence. Barely breathing. He called me. I didn't think he'd make it through surgery." Her voice cracked again. "But he did. He fought. Harder than any animal I've ever treated." Grandpa nodded, tears dropping from his chin onto Ethan's dark curls. "That's our Shadow," he whispered. "Stubborn as a mule." Shadow blinked slowly, his gaze drifting from Ethan's tear-streaked face to Grandpa's lined, grief-softened eyes. He let out a low, soft whine, too weak to wag his tail, but his eyes glowed faintly with relief and love. Ethan pressed his forehead against Shadow's muzzle, his voice breaking into raw, unfiltered sobs as he whispered, "I'll always remember you. Always. You're my best friend, my hero, my Shadow." For a long time, no one moved. The snow fell outside the frosted windows, silent and pure, blanketing the yard and the small stone marker Ethan had placed days before. The world outside was white and quiet, but inside the living room, warmth spread like dawn across dark water. Shadow's breathing slowed into a heavy, uneven rhythm, exhaustion dragging him back toward sleep. But just before his eyes closed, his voice flickered in Ethan's chest one last time. "Thank you for seeing me, for loving me, when no one else did." Ethan clutched his friend tighter, tears soaking into the blue fleece as the Husky drifted into healing sleep. Dr. Melinda brushed trembling fingers over Shadow's ears, her own tears falling onto the cone's clear plastic. Grandpa bowed his head, shoulders shaking as silent sobs rolled through his broad chest. Outside, dawn broke across the snowbound hills in pale gold, catching the drifting flakes and turning them into falling stars. And in that quiet living room, wrapped in blankets and love and tears, a boy and his dog held on to each other, like two souls pulled from the edge of darkness into the first light of hope. Winter melted into spring in quiet, steady breaths. Snowdrifts shrank under the pale March sun, revealing damp black earth and the first bright green shoots pushing up through cold, cracked ground. The cottonwoods budded with tight silver catkins. The river ran swollen with meltwater, roaring louder each day as ice broke and drifted away in jagged shards. Shadow healed slowly in Dr. Melinda's small white clinic at the edge of town. Each morning, Ethan rode his old bicycle down the dirt road to visit him, the metal basket rattling with apples, carrot sticks, and packets of turkey jerky saved from his lunch. Shadow would lift his head when he heard the bell on Ethan's bike, his pale blue eyes lighting up, ears pricking forward. Ethan would sit beside him for hours, curled up against the thick fleece blanket draped over Shadow's back. Sometimes he read aloud from his school library books, stories about wolves in Alaska, about brave dogs who rescued their owners from fires or avalanches. Other times he just sat in silence, stroking Shadow's fur, listening to his slow, deep breaths, feeling his ribs rise and fall under his palm. "Don't ever leave again." "Okay," Ethan whispered one morning, pressing his forehead against Shadow's scarred muzzle. The Husky's chest rumbled with a soft whine. He flicked his tongue out to lick the boy's cheek once gently, before laying his head back down on his outstretched paws. Dr. Melinda watched them from the doorway. Her eyes always softened when she saw them together, but behind the softness lay something sharper, an ache she carried alone in the quiet rooms of her clinic. She had seen so many dogs come through these doors, broken beyond repair. Shadow was different. His body was battered and scarred, his mind haunted by shadows darker than his name. But his spirit glowed with something bright and unbreakable. She saw it in the way he leaned into Ethan's touch, in the way his tail thumped weakly whenever Grandpa James entered with a treat tucked in his coat pocket. She saw it in his eyes when he watched the world through the window by his recovery cot, and an endless patient gaze waiting for something he could not name, but knew he would find. It was a Tuesday morning when she first noticed it. She was changing the bandage on his hind leg, humming softly under her breath, when Shadow's head snapped up. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. He swung his gaze toward the small curtained doorway that led to her office, muscles trembling with sudden tension. "What is it, big guy?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. There was no one there, just the quiet hum of her computer and the faint ticking of the wall clock above her desk. But Shadow wouldn't stop staring. His body quivered with alertness, eyes locked on the doorway, nose twitching as he scented something only he could smell. Later that day, Dr. Melinda rubbed the ache in her side for the 100th time. It had been bothering her for weeks, a sharp stitch under her ribs that flared when she bent to lift heavy crates of food. She made a note to call her doctor the next morning, though she half expected him to scold her for worrying too much. She was healthy. She ate well, walked 2 miles every morning before the clinic opened, took her vitamins with cold-pressed juice every sunrise. But 2 weeks later, she sat in the fluorescent quiet of the oncology unit, staring at the words on the ultrasound printout: suspicious mass. Possible malignant neoplasm. Biopsy recommended. Her hand trembled as she set the paper down on the sterile metal table. Tears blurred the edges of the black and white image. A tumor under her ribs, nestled against her liver like a dark, sleeping serpent. And in that moment, the memory came flooding back. Shadow's sudden tension, his nose flaring the low whine in his chest as he pressed his muzzle against her side with such urgency that she thought he'd gone mad. He knew. Somehow he had known. The surgery went well. The tumor was small, caught early. Her recovery was swift, though her strength came back in slow, aching steps. Every day she returned to the clinic, Shadow pressed his nose to her side, sniffing, then licking her wrist with a deep sigh before settling back onto his blanket. "You saved me," she whispered to him one evening as the last orange light of sunset spilled across the clinic floor. Shadow blinked slowly, pale blue eyes glowing in the fading light. He rested his head on her knee, breathing deep and even. And that's when the idea bloomed in her mind, quiet and unstoppable as spring grass pushing up through frost-cracked earth. Dr. Melinda began training Shadow with quiet purpose. She borrowed scent detection kits from the University of Denver's veterinary program. Shadow learned faster than any dog she'd trained in her 20 years as a veterinary specialist. His focus was absolute, his nose precise beyond measure. She moved from training scents to samples donated by local oncology patients. Sweat swabs, breath samples, skin cells brushed onto sterile gauze. Each time, Shadow identified the cancer-positive samples with unwavering accuracy. Word spread quickly, first to Denver General Hospital, then to the Children's Oncology Ward downtown. They called it an experimental therapy program, but the children didn't care about protocols or paperwork. They only cared about Shadow. His first day in the children's wing, Ethan walked beside him, down the quiet fluorescent hallway. Shadow wore a bright blue therapy dog vest, strapped snug over his broad chest, the Denver Braveheart badge sewn onto the front pocket in neat navy stitches. Ethan carried a bag of turkey jerky in one hand, the other resting lightly on Shadow's back as they walked. Children peered out from pastel-painted rooms as they passed. Some wore colorful knitted beanies over bald scalps. Others pulled small oxygen tanks on wheeled stands tubes looped under their noses. Their eyes widened at the sight of the big silver husky, his pale blue gaze scanning each doorway, ears flicking back and forth. Shadow stopped in front of a small girl with paper-thin skin and huge brown eyes. An IV tube snaked from her tiny wrist into a bag of clear fluid on a metal stand beside her bed. She clutched a stuffed unicorn so tight, its pink fur was flattened against her chest. Shadow stepped forward slowly, lowering his head until his nose brushed her wrist. The girl gasped softly, eyes shining as her thin fingers slid into the thick silver fur around his neck. "Hi, puppy," she whispered, voice hoarse with fatigue. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in silent, glittering rivers. "You're so pretty." Shadow licked her knuckles once gently, then curled his massive body onto the floor beside her bed. The girl giggled a tiny, quiet sound, but it cracked the heavy silence in the room, like sunrise through winter clouds. Dr. Melinda stood in the doorway, tears blurring her vision. Ethan crouched beside Shadow, one small hand resting on his scarred muzzle. Shadow leaned into his touch, sighing softly, eyes closing as the little girl's trembling fingers brushed his ears. Shadow visited the hospital every Wednesday and Friday. Each time he walked the halls in his bright blue vest, head held high, tail wagging gently. Children laughed and cried and whispered their secrets into his silver fur. Some told him about their dreams of horses and outer space and running barefoot through grass. Others pressed their faces into his neck and wept silent tears for the pain they could not name. Shadow licked away every tear. He listened to every secret. He curled beside every broken heart until its trembling slowed to sleep. And when he wasn't comforting, he was detecting. Quietly, efficiently, without fail, he alerted Dr. Melinda and the oncology team to 3 early-stage tumors in the first month alone. Each one treated before it could grow roots into young lungs and livers. One afternoon, Ethan sat beside Shadow on the floor of room 212 reading aloud from White Fang. His voice was soft and clear, trembling only when he reached the parts where the wolf dog learned love for the first time. Shadow lay with his head in Ethan's lap, pale blue eyes, half-lidded, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that soothed the children drifting in and out of sleep around them. When Ethan finished the last chapter, he closed the book with trembling fingers and bent his head over Shadow's ear. His tears dripped onto the husky's thick fur as he whispered, "I'll always remember you. You're my hero, Shadow, forever." Shadow flicked his ear, then lifted his muzzle to press his cold nose against Ethan's cheek. His tail thumped weakly against the linoleum floor once, twice, the quiet rhythm echoing like a heartbeat in the silent room. Dr. Melinda watched them from the doorway, a clipboard clutched to her chest. Tears blurred her vision, turning the world into streaks of gold and silver and soft gray. She pressed her free hand to her ribs, feeling the smooth, healed skin beneath her scrubs. "He saved me," she whispered under her breath, her voice trembling with wonder and grief and gratitude so deep it ached in her bones. Now he's saving them. And as the sun set behind the hospital's tall windows, painting the children's wing in warm gold, Shadow lifted his head. His pale blue eyes glowed with quiet strength as he pressed closer into Ethan's side. For the first time in his life, the shadows that haunted him lifted, leaving behind only light. Spring slipped into summer, with the quiet inevitability of dawn brushing darkness from the hills. The cottonwoods swayed in warm breezes, their pale green leaves fluttering like silent applause under the pale blue Colorado sky. The river ran high and fast, chattering over rocks polished smooth by centuries of snowmelt. And the clinic at the edge of town smelled of cut grass, blooming daffodils, and antiseptic. Ethan pressed his small brown hand against the glass door, peering into the waiting room with wide, eager eyes. His hair fell in damp curls over his forehead, still wet from his morning bath. The collar of his t-shirt was dark with sweat and river water, a badge of summer adventure. Grandpa stood behind him, his broad hand resting gently on Ethan's narrow shoulder, thumb rubbing slow circles into the soft cotton. "Go on, Peanut." Grandpa whispered, his deep voice trembling with quiet emotion. He's waiting. Ethan didn't need telling twice. He shoved the door open with both hands, letting it bang against the rubber stopper as he sprinted inside, sneakers squeaking on the polished linoleum. The room smelled like Dr. Melinda's lavender soap and the faint warm musk of sleeping animals. And there, curled on his fleece blanket by the sunny window, lay Shadow. His silver-gray fur shone in the morning light, thick and healthy again. the shaved patches along his side now covered with soft downy regrowth. His hind leg was thinner than the other, the muscles still rebuilding from long weeks in a cast, but it held his weight firmly as he rose to meet Ethan. His pale blue eyes glowed with recognition. His tail thumped against the floor slow and steady, at first, then faster, as Ethan dropped to his knees beside him. "Hey, big guy," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion pressing into his chest. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them blur this moment into watery half-shadows. He pressed his forehead against Shadow's broad skull, feeling the warmth beneath thick fur, the quiet rumble of a happy sigh vibrating through the dog's chest. Shadow licked Ethan's chin once, twice, his tongue rough and warm and familiar. Then he pressed closer, pushing his heavy head into Ethan's small chest with a force that nearly knocked the boy onto his back. Ethan laughed, a bright, bubbling sound that made Grandpa's throat tighten where he stood watching. "He missed you," Peanut Grandpa said softly, his deep voice rough with unspoken tears. "I missed him more," Ethan whispered back, arms wrapping tight around Shadow's thick neck. He buried his face in silver fur that smelled of sunlight and clean sheets and quiet healing. For a long moment, the world fell silent around them. The only sound, the steady whoosh of cars passing on the county road beyond the clinic walls. Then Ethan pulled back, wiping his nose on the hem of his t-shirt. His eyes glowed with excitement. "Come on, Shadow," he said, standing and tugging gently on the therapy vest's Velcro strap. "Let's go play." They walked out together into the golden afternoon. The sun hung low over the foothills, casting long, soft rays across the clinic's grassy yard. Birds trilled in the cottonwoods. The breeze carried the scent of clover and warm earth. Ethan pulled a bright blue rubber ball from his back pocket. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the cool, flexible surface against his palms. Then he looked at Shadow, his small smile spreading into a wide, gap-toothed grin. "Ready?" he asked, his voice trembling with joy. Shadow's ears flicked forward. His tail swished once, twice, stirring the dust at his paws. His pale blue eyes locked onto the ball with laser-focus muscles coiling tight under thick silver fur. A soft rumble built in his chest, a quiet, eager growl that made Ethan laugh out loud. He pulled his arm back and threw the ball with all his strength. It sailed through the air, spinning end over end, a bright blue comet trailing through gold light. Shadow lunged forward with a power that stole Ethan's breath. His paws thudded against the earth muscles, bunching and releasing with effortless grace. The scars along his flanks flashed silver in the sun as he ran, reminders of a past filled with pain and blood and darkness. But today, they gleamed like metals. He caught the ball just before it bounced into the cottonwood shadows. His jaws closed around it with a satisfying squeak. For a moment he stood there, chest heaving, ears pricked forward, eyes glowing with triumph. Then he turned back toward Ethan and trotted slowly across the grass. Each step was careful, his bad leg landing gingerly, but his tail wagged in a wide, happy arc behind him. Ethan clapped his hands, jumping up and down with delight. "Good boy. That's my brave boy." Shadow dropped the ball at Ethan's feet and pressed his muzzle into the boy's belly, whining softly with joy. Ethan laughed again, wrapping his arms around Shadow's neck and burying his face in thick fur that smelled of sun and grass and hope. Dr. Melinda watched from the porch steps. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, hands gripping her elbows, as tears spilled silently down her cheeks. She saw the way Ethan clung to Shadow, the way Shadow leaned into him, with his entire weight trusting him completely. She saw the healing there, the bright, fierce light of it glowing between them, stronger than any wound or scar or shadow. Behind her, Grandpa stepped out of the clinic, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He paused when he saw her tears, his own eyes reddening with unshed grief and relief. "He's a miracle, isn't he?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. Dr. Melinda nodded, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. "Yes," she whispered. "He really is." The sun dipped lower, the sky blushing with pink and orange, fading into dusky violet at the edges. Ethan and Shadow played until the shadows grew long and the breeze carried the first chill of evening. Finally, Ethan sank down onto the grass breath, coming in quiet, tired gasps. Shadow curled beside him, resting his heavy head on the boy's small lap. Ethan stroked his ears gently, eyes half closed against the brilliant streaks of sunset painting the sky. For a long, silent moment, they sat together in perfect peace, the golden light wrapping around them like a quiet blessing. Then Ethan bent his head close to Shadow's ear, his voice trembling as he whispered, "I'll always remember you, no matter where you go or what happens next. You're my best friend forever." Shadow sighed softly, a deep rumble vibrating through his chest. His tail thumped once against the cool evening grass. His pale blue eyes flickered open, catching the last rays of the dying sun, and for a moment they glowed gold. As the screen faded to black, words appeared in simple white letters. The narrator's voice warm and calm. We cannot choose where we are born or what darkness we must survive. But we can choose how we live. And we can choose how we love. The final shot lingered, Ethan and Shadow running across the field under a blazing sunset. Their shadows stretched long behind them, dark and gold entwined, flickering together into the silent coming night. The sky burned with brilliant orange and lavender, and pale silver, the horizon glowing like a promise no darkness could break. And for a single breathless moment, the world felt whole, quiet, free, hopeful.